Tonight, Republicans will make their opening arguments to the American people about why President Trump should get another 4 years in the White House. The Republican National Convention is already underway in Charlotte, North Carolina. The four-day festivities will be mostly remote, with live speeches also coming from the D.C. area later in the week. Demonstrators lined up outside the Charlotte Convention Center over the weekend. Most were peaceful, with few major reported incidents. This afternoon, Republicans officially renominated both President Trump and Vice President Pence. The president spoke for nearly an hour today. He again cast unsubstantiated doubts on the safety of mail-in voting and claimed without evidence that Democrats plan to take the election away from him.
Bad things happened last time with the spying on our campaign, and that goes to Biden and that goes to Obama. And we have to be very, very careful. Have to be very, very careful. And this time they're trying to do it with the whole post office scam. They'll blame it on the post office. You could see them setting it up. Be very careful and watch it very carefully, because we have to win. This is the most important election in the history of our country.
Mr. Trump is expected to speak at the RNC during each of the 4 days. His full remarks will come Thursday evening from the White House. Tonight, we'll hear from Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, one of just 3 black United States senators and the only Republican. Other primetime speakers will include House Minority Whip Steve Scalise, House Oversight Ranking Member Jim Jordan, former U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Nikki Haley, and the president's son, Donald Trump Jr. A number of conservative activists will also speak. What's less clear is the agenda from the Republicans this week and the next 4 years. The party is not voting on a platform at the convention. The platform typically lays out the party's policy goals if they reclaim the White House. Instead, Republicans are vowing their, quote, strong support for the president and his America First agenda. For his part, the president has unveiled his pledges for a second term. They include returning to normal in 2021, holding China accountable for the coronavirus, and draining the swamp. The Trump campaign has not laid out how the president intends to achieve these goals. Let's bring in our panel, Ed O'Keefe, Caitlin Huey-Burns, and Liz Goodwin. Ed is a CBS News political correspondent. Caitlin is a CBSN political reporter. And Liz is Deputy Washington Bureau Chief for the Boston Globe. Welcome to you all. Ed, I want to get right to you. I hear you have some breaking news on Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. What have you learned?
That's right, Elaine. Look, after several days of questions about this, the Biden-Harris campaign now says that the Democratic nominee and vice presidential nominee will be tested regularly for COVID-19, and that the staff that comes into contact with them regularly also will be. There were questions over the weekend and since Thursday when they were together at the convention in Wilmington about whether or not, especially the vice president, former vice president, had been tested at all for the virus. The campaign continued to say that he hadn't been, and then yesterday on one of the Sunday shows, one of his spokespeople was asked about it again, said he doesn't have it, but he hasn't been tested, which caused a lot of confusion and questioning as to how she would know that if he hadn't in fact been tested. So today now they're saying he will be. They say this is in keeping with the advice of medical professionals. And notably, Elaine, and let's remember this in the event that we learn about something later, the campaign says that if either of them tests positive, they will tell the world that in fact has happened in a bid with transparency. Again, all of this, they say, is in keeping with the responsible behavior they've been trying to promote. I suppose the only question is why it took them so long to announce this, but they concede that part of this is because the two of them may begin traveling soon across the country. There's currently no plan for them to do that. In fact, this week they're keeping a very light schedule focused mostly on virtual events for Senator Harris, but it's a sign that they acknowledge it's something that has to be done and will be done in the future.
Well, that was going to be my question, Ed, is about why it took so long, several days, you said, to get a definitive answer on this. It's just not clear right now.
It is a good question, and you know, part of the frustration, frankly, for reporters has been A, we've been asking it pretty relentlessly over the last several weeks, but B, reporters who were there in the room last week to witness Harris and Biden's speeches. Remember, they gave them in what was essentially a converted television studio to make it look like the convention hall. But in each instance, there were about 20 reporters from various news outlets who were part of the so-called pool in the room, who'd had to undergo rigorous testing beforehand in order to be there, in order to get clearance to attend. Not only to Secret Service clearance, of course, at this point now, but you also have to pass a medical test. So the question was, well, if we have to do it, why isn't the candidate doing it, especially given his age and the potential risk? So now the campaign's saying it will happen. We'll see, again, what that looks like, and if they tell us on a regular basis how often or after which events. And most importantly, their vow to let us know if, in fact, one of them does test positive. Obviously, we don't want that to happen. Nobody would wish that on anyone right now. But it's a sign that they're going to be transparent about this if there was any concern that perhaps part of the reason he hadn't been tested or that they wouldn't tell us was because of some kind of a cover-up. Apparently, they're saying that's not the case.
All right, we look forward to seeing what the results are and if more questions are answered moving forward here. Caitlin, let me turn to you and the Republican convention. We know President Trump is breaking with tradition and will speak every night of this convention. Do we know if he plans to speak on or off script? Are there general themes that he plans to cover?
Well, if today was any indication, and actually if the past 4 or 5 years have been any indication, you can expect an off-script Donald Trump. Today, he appeared in front of delegates to the National Convention in Charlotte in person. He was supposed to give remarks, ended up being nearly an hour, where he kind of went off several different tangents, one of which was railing against mail-in voting and claiming that it's going to be fraudulent without any verification of that, as you mentioned at the top. So he is breaking with tradition in appearing in some form every day, but also remember that last week Joe Biden appeared pretty much every night of the convention in some way as well. He did, kind of virtual town halls with people. He made appearances here and there throughout the week. So we could expect something like that from Donald Trump. The campaign hasn't said it explicitly what they will do in terms of these appearances. But you could tell today, given his remarks, that he was eager to be out there campaigning, eager to talk about whatever he wants to talk about, especially the election itself and voting itself. And you could tell that because he hasn't been able to have rallies over the past few months, that he sees this convention this week as a way to hold similar types of events.
Well, Liz, let me ask you, when you listen to the rhetoric that we're hearing now from the president and from Republicans, how does 2020 compare to what the president and the party promised in 2016?
Yeah, I think that's a major theme of this convention because Trump came in with a lot of promises on the economy in particular. And that was a big emphasis of his speech today, even though, as Caitlin mentioned, there were a lot of detours into, mail-in ballots and things like that because he is off script. But a big theme of what he was trying to say today is, the stock market is doing amazing. We added all these jobs. And I think that's going to be a bit tough as an overall message. I think for the base, that could fly. But because, we have double-digit employment right now, people are really worried about the future. The fact that the president seems to be painting a very rosy economic picture right now and saying, I came in as the businessman and look what I delivered, look at this economy. I think it's a little bit of a rough message right now for him overall. That said, he still does have higher ratings on the economy than Joe Biden. So it's still an edge he has. It makes sense for him to press that edge. But the rosiness of the picture he's painting overall, I think, is a bit stretches credulity, I guess.
Well, let's talk more about this idea of rosiness. Ed, last week on CBS This Morning, Vice President Pence criticized Joe Biden for what he said was an overwhelmingly negative Democratic National Convention. Let's play those remarks.
I found not just those words by Joe Biden last night, but so many of the speeches at the Democratic National Convention were so negative. They presented such a grim vision for America.
Then today at his vice presidential nomination acceptance speech, Pence closed his remarks with this message to Republicans.
With your continued support and with God's help, we're going to make America great again. Again.
Ed, talk to me a little bit about the messaging issue perhaps for Republicans in this convention.
Well, I don't think they quite know what they're for anymore, other than getting the president reelected. I think that's become pretty evident pretty quickly. We have seen the president bounce around on slogans. We've seen the president bounce around on attack lines against Joe Biden. And even today, we see them essentially recycling the taglines and rhetoric they used exactly 4 years ago at their convention. And it just signals that they have no sense of what it is they're supposed to be about. And look, it may work. He has his base of support. That kind of sort of consistent messaging worked for them 4 years ago. Of course, we didn't have a pandemic. We didn't have the kind of challenger that Joe Biden is. We didn't have evidence that Joe Biden might be peeling away people simply because he's an alternative from the president. But unless or until the president this week starts to articulate a little more clearly what exactly they want to get done in a second term, which is what voters often want to hear from an incumbent, it's going to be really tricky to determine what it is they're supposed to be about. There's been some excellent reporting on this done by people we talk to on a regular basis on this program about, how the president has struggled with incumbency and running as the incumbent, and with what exactly the Republican Party is supposed to be going forward, other than a cult of personality for the president. I can see the vice president's point about last week, that there wasn't much there in terms of what Democrats would do. That is a fair argument. Beyond Joe Biden broadly sketching out plans to deal with the pandemic and make better use of the Defense Production Act and that mask mandate that he's calling for, and some general theories on who would get taxed and who wouldn't, and protecting Social Security, there wasn't much specificity, despite polling that showed that people wanted specifics on what exactly a Biden-Harris administration would do. This week, the Republican polling that we did shows much the same, that Republicans want to hear what the president and vice president would like to continue doing if they get 4 more years. We'll see if there's any actual conversation about that this week.
All right, so Caitlin, let's dig into one aspect of the president's agenda. So the president's Fighting for You second-term agenda does not mention anything about race-related issues. And we should note this platform was unveiled hours after video surfaced appearing to show Kenosha, Wisconsin police shooting Jacob Blake, a 29-year-old black man, multiple times in the back while he was trying to enter his car. Caitlin, how do Republicans plan to address this issue of race at the RNC this week?
Well, in a little bit of a preview, the president today referenced opportunity zones. You'll hear from Tim Scott tonight, speaking at the RNC, who has been a big champion of that. He'll likely also talk about criminal justice reform, and actually a bipartisan effort led by this White House that people like Cory Booker and others signed on to, but have been demanding more in terms of policy. But other than that, he really hasn't addressed it at all, and in fact has kind of gone the other way and really kind of focused on what he has lamented as cancel culture. And he's also been attacking mayors of cities where there have been demonstrations. And he's also been using racist rhetoric to talk about a transformation in the suburbs that he's supposedly warning about. So we haven't really seen him embrace this discussion in any thoughtful or meaningful way, but I expect that he and others will point to those two things as a reason for that. But this comes, as you mentioned, against the backdrop of yet another shooting and an issue that we have seen become a rallying force around the country, not just in cities, but in suburbs and small towns, and something that the president has not addressed in a meaningful way.
Well, Liz, last week we saw Democrats attempt to reach across the aisle with former Republicans who laid out why they're voting for the president. Is the president doing anything this week to expand his electorate beyond the Republican base?
So there is one Democratic House member in Georgia State House, who is now a supporter of Mr. Trump, who has a speaking slot at this convention. To my knowledge, that's the only sort of Democratic voice they're spotlighting, but I could be wrong. They're adding people, but it's definitely not the same intensity of focus. You saw the DNC last week, where so many Republicans were featured to kind of create a permission structure for more conservative people in the country who might be uncomfortable with Trump to back Joe Biden. It was a lot of sort of vouching for Biden from the conservative perspective, from John Kasich, Colin Powell, even just regular Republicans and videos, regular voters talking about it. That does not seem to be a focus here. And that makes sense when you think about it, because I think President Trump is probably governed toward the base more than any president in recent memory. And it's just not really his style to be reaching out, especially to people who might not support him. So I doubt that will be a big focus of this week.
All right, I misspoke a moment ago. These were former Republicans, or Republicans rather, who said they would not be supporting President Trump this year. Ed, let me turn to you. While the convention goes on, one of the president's top advisors, Kellyanne Conway, is leaving the White House. Now, she'll still speak at the RNC this week, but why is she stepping away, Ed? And remind us of how vital she was to the president's victory back in 2016.
Sure, a longtime Republican pollster who was brought into the 2016 campaign to right-size it towards the end has remained a loyal and in many ways at times behind-the-scenes strategist in the West Wing who, comes out and does interviews and defends the president when necessary, but otherwise has played a pretty behind-the-scenes operator role in recent years. She says she needs to focus on her family. She and her husband, George Conway, have 4 children, and it appears the pressures of the work she does and the work he'd been doing are, complicating things. It's understandable as working parents. Conway, her husband, George Conway, is one of the founders of the Lincoln Project, this Republican anti-Trump group that is now running millions of dollars worth of ads across the country to try to convince people to vote against the president. She, of course, a loyal lieutenant to the president. It's been the cause of some drama, not only in their family apparently, but also, of course, in the press, talking about how it is that this couple could possibly be on either end of this debate. Mr. Conway, of course, had been considered briefly for a Justice Department role at the beginning of the administration and took a pass. So she will appear in her personal capacity Wednesday at the convention, and then after that, she says, is essentially going to be stepping back in the coming days. One of the longest-serving Trump aides and survivors, really, not only of the campaign but of the administration, and one the president surely is sad to see go.
Right, and particularly notable, Ed, as you said, because that longevity despite that very vocal opposition to the president by her husband. All right, Ed O'Keefe, Caitlin Huey-Burns, and Liz Goodwin, thank you all very much. Appreciate it.